I know, Julie and Karen. That's right. I'm gonna try get through this intro, but we have a really excited verbal toddler. But I just want to I want to thank you all for being with us this evening. Tonight's event would have been both a lecture and a welcome back to our Torah scroll that's been out for repair. But we will welcome back our scroll very soon. But given the weather, it just made most sense to, rather than fully postpone, to hold the learning part of our evening on Zoom here, and it's great that that we have a nice turnout of people who are attending. Before I that's right. Before I welcome Julie Seltzer. Yes, indeed. You want to get? Why don't you get Bunny? We'll show everybody Bunny. Go find Bunny. I do want to. So that because of the storm, we sent the babysitter home early to get home, and alas, here I am. I want to acknowledge. I want to acknowledge. That's right. I want to acknowledge Sarah Sherman. Sarah Sherman, who, my love. That's right. I'm going to come get it in 1 minute. I want to acknowledge Sarah Sherman, a regular Shabbat attendee, a Torah reader, a committee member of the Religious Affairs Committee, a dedicated congregant. Sarah, who, without any fanfare and quite behind the scenes, has personally underwritten our Torah repair campaign, and is thus the main sponsor of tonight's learning session. So a big yasher koach to Sarah Sherman. We are, and you're getting jazz hands, Sarah. We're thrilled to welcome our guest, Julie Seltzer. Julie is a scribe and an educator with a background in theater arts. Julie has been writing Torah scrolls and other sacred objects since 2009, when she was the scribe in residence at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, California. Julie lives in the Hudson Valley, New York. Another reason why coming together in person just really didn't make sense tonight. We wouldn't want our scribe, Julie, to have to contend with the weather getting back later. She lives in the Hudson Valley with her Israeli Matshusha. And anybody who utilizes Safaria's website, which is really the collection of all online biblical and rabbinic material, it is Julie's hand that's featured on Safaria's website. Julie, maybe you'll say more about that and how that came to be. During Julie's talk, Julie definitely encourages comments, questions. So I'm grateful to our Gabbai team of Karen Tucker and Amy Dantis and Rabbi Julie, who will help to monitor the chat box and the muting and unmuting for comments and questions. So without further ado, I'm going to mute so you can all have an enjoyable class. And it is a great honor to welcome someone who's become a friend and a friend to the congregation, Julie Seltzer. Hi, Julie.
Hi, thank you so much, Rabbi Ari, and thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Amy, and thank you, Rabbi Julie, and thank you, everyone else, for being here. And it would have been nice to meet you all in person, but somehow this can feel more intimate because I get to see all of you up close, and I hope you feel that intimacy too. And I'm looking forward to tonight's learning. And I hope you ask a lot of questions. It's very true that I love being interrupted. I love hearing questions. And I have a PowerPoint presentation with lots of pictures, and I'll start that in a moment. But first, I want to just introduce myself in terms of how and why I came to do this. It'll be very brief. I actually do a whole session on that, but I actually, my background was sort of in Jewish studies, and I came to this from the Jewish studies kind of angle, not from the calligraphy or artistic side. In fact, I had zero artistic inclination, not visual art, and I really had to practice a lot. It did not come to me naturally. In fact, I found a report card from third or fourth grade from Hebrew school, and I had straight A's except for one subject. Anyone? Back when they used to grade handwriting. I had like a B- or something. Anyway, one day I was walking down the street. I was actually in Israel on a visit, and the thought popped in my head that I want to learn the scribal arts. And I spent the next several months just on my own looking for information, starting to practice, buying supplies, figuring out how to hold the pen. I had no idea. I'll talk more about the instruments. And it was at a time that my mother was dying. She had just been diagnosed with lung cancer. And I think I was searching both for a way to kind of focus inward and do something that was kind of calm, or I thought it would be, calm, but also something that stretched back through the ages and that would stretch forward in time as I was sort of facing, her mortality and mortality in general. So that's a little bit about why and I got into it, and that was 2007 that I started learning. And so here we are 15 years later, and I'm excited to talk about the Megillah. So I'm gonna share my screen. And I'll just double check that you all are seeing the first slide, writing in the Megillah. Okay, I assume someone will tell me if not. So when we talk about the themes of Purim and the Megillah, we often talk about nafochu, overturning or things being upside down. We talk about identity. We talk about revelation. Esther, is she going to reveal her true identity and when? And we talk about women's power, and all of these are themes in the Megillah. But we rarely talk about writing, which is also a major theme in the Megillah, writing itself. And oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, when I say the word Megillah, I'm just using it to refer to Megillat Esther. There are other Megillot, as you probably know, but Esther is the only one that must be read from a scroll. So that's why it has kind of special status. That's why it's, the Megillah. So in fact, many of the scribal rules, sort of how we write, and there are many rules, are based on Masechet Megillah, the tractate of Talmud about Megillah and Purim, because it's based on the book of Esther, of course. And in the book of Esther, there's a lot of talk about writing. So I'll just read a few of these. Let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media. This was recorded in the book of Annals. The king's scribes were summoned, there we go, and a decree was issued to every province in its own script and to every people in its own language. There it was found written that Mordechai had denounced Bigtan and Teresh. And you may further write with regard to the Jews as you see fit. Write it in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet, for an edict that has been written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet may not be revoked. So the king's scribes were summoned, and letters were written at Mordechai's dictation to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. So the words katav, write, and sefer, book, are peppered throughout the Megillah. Written language, and particularly alphabets, was a relatively new tool at the time this story takes place, around 500 BCE. And it's powerful because it allows for more reliable communication across time and space. In Achashverosh's kingdom, the king's kingdom, writing allowed for word to reach the disparate provinces. Of course, nowadays we have email and they had horses, so it took longer. But writing gave the messages a kind of power and a kind of officialness that they wouldn't have otherwise had. And as we just skimmed, a written document with the king's seal could not even be revoked. And this is why Esther had to request a new decree to override the old one. And here we get to kind of the climax of the story. And I wanted to bring, you'll understand in a moment why I wanted to bring this line. This is Vatichtov Esther Malka bat Avichail uMordechai Yehudi et kol tokef lekayem et igeret hapurim hazot hashinit. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Avichail, wrote a second letter of Purim for the purpose of confirming with full authority the aforementioned one of Mordechai the Jew. And so when I talk about Megillah and which communities accept Megillot that have been written by a woman, because not all do, however, more do accept Megillah written by a woman than, for example, a Torah scroll written by a woman. And this isn't precisely the reason, but I still think it's hard to argue against a Megillah written by a woman when in the Megillah itself, it says that a woman, that is Esther, wrote it. And I love that the Hebrew, the Tav, you can see my cursor, this letter, which is the feminine indicator in the word she wrote, that's what this word is, she wrote, Vatichtov, is written in a large script. So there's a few kind of large letters in the Megillah, and there are a few small ones. So this is one of the large letters, perhaps emphasizing that it was a woman who wrote it. Okay, any questions about that? I'm going to turn now to the process of how a Megillah is written and created, a Megillah scroll, that is. Anything in the chat? I see there's nothing in the chat box, but are there any questions up to this point? Great. So we will start with what every aspect of scribal work starts with, that is kavanah, or intentionality. It is there in all aspects of what's called stam. Stam is an acronym, and it stands for the objects that scribes are trained to write. So in Hebrew, it's samech tav mem, and it stands for Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and the mem is mezuzah and Megillah kind of combined in the mem. And those are all written in a special way according to special rules. And every part of the process, so as a scribe, before I start to write anything, I say out loud, I am writing for the sake of the sanctity of the Megillah or of the mezuzah, whatever it is I'm writing. I say it in Hebrew, but I could say it in English if I want. The point is to state the intention. And that was done by the parchment maker before they soaked the animal skin in lime to clean it. They said, I am preparing this parchment for use in sacred writing. Or before I started repairs on your Torah scroll, I said, I am making this repair. Perhaps I was sewing, right? If I was doing a seam, I actually did many seams on your scroll. There were ended up being 9 seams that needed re-sewing. So I said, I am sewing for the sake of the kedusha, the sanctity of the Torah scroll. Okay, just scroll down here. So I forgot to say one thing about kavanah. It's going to go back for 1 second. There's also a statement of intention before each name of God. So before you write a name of God, you say out loud, I'm writing this name for the sake of God's holy name. Of course, this is not relevant in a Megillah because God's name doesn't appear. It just, as people say, it appears in a hidden way. God appears, hidden in the Megillah. But it is true for all the other writings, for mezuzah and tefillin and Sefer Torah. So those all require special intention. And there are 10 different names of God in the Torah. Okay, so now we go to parchment. So all writing, all sacred writing is written on parchment. That's animal skin. And cloth is the most common type, to the point where mezuzah is actually just referred to as a cloth, like the writing of a mezuzah on a piece of parchment is called cloth. But what cloth means is parchment. It's a certain kind of parchment. And there's another kind of parchment called gvil, which is thicker, slightly different processing. It's the full skin, whereas cloth is the shaved down skin. And it's seen often in North African scrolls. So the bottom picture, you have an example of a Tunisian Megillah that I saw at the University of Pennsylvania. They asked what my purpose was in seeing this object, and I said, fun. Couldn't think of any other purpose, but I should have said, in order to bring the picture to Zoom learning sessions. So you can see just by the color that it's different processing. It starts to turn orange. It can be quite beautiful, and it's thick, and it's usually deer skin. You can see the pattern of the animal's skin, right? These are not coffee stains. These are brown splotches from the cow. The parchment is made by soaking it, cleaning it, scraping it, drying it, sanding it. There's many different aspects and pieces to the puzzle, and it can take months to make parchment. I do want to point out that it's not permitted to kill an animal specifically and only for its use, for it to use its skins for sacred writing. It has to be either killed for food, or it can have died naturally or by any other, by an accident. I would always joke about wanting to make roadkill tefillin. And now it's not even a joke, because there apparently is someone in, I think, Colorado who is doing just that, from animals who died kind of like tragically, and at least there's an elevation of their lives by using their skin. Hopefully, at least we see it like that. So that is the parchment. Any questions about the parchment? I see there's a couple of things in the chat. The Tunisian Megillah doesn't seem to have any spaces between the words. Yeah, the spacing is tighter. Yeah, but there's a range of what's acceptable. And so clearly this was a norm. Larry, where do I get the parchment that I use? I'm actually going to get to that after I finish with all the different supplies. I'm going to show you a picture of where I get it, but I'll tell you that it's in Jerusalem. Any other questions that aren't in the chat? Does the animal have to have been healthy? No, but it can't have like big hole, like punctured skin. I mean, I don't know how they would know that an animal was healthy or not in terms of its internal organs. So no. And it doesn't have to be, like I said, it doesn't have to be kosher. It's not the same kind of kosher. It has to be kosher species. So most of the parchment that's these days, most of the parchment that's used is cow, just because there's so many cows, but also goat, sheep, deer. Roadkill is not too healthy. Well, it might have been healthy before the event. And giraffe. I should say theoretically giraffe, because giraffes are kosher. And my teacher Jen Taylor Friedman would always joke about wanting to write a Megillah on a giraffe skin because you could do it on one long piece and you wouldn't have to do it in separate pieces. And I once met a zoo, someone who worked in the zoo at the Bronx Zoo, and I said, so let me ask you a question. If a giraffe happened to die, what is it possible I might, be able to get its skin? And she was like, no way. So this will probably remain a fantasy. But technically yes, be on a giraffe. More questions about parchment before we move on to, oh, actually, it looks like the next slide is where I buy my supplies. So, anything else? Okay. So this is the supply store. You can see these are little cubby holes with lots and lots of parchment rolled up and stored. They have, in this case, dehumidifiers going, or they set it, maybe it depends on the time of year. In Jerusalem really has kind of in general, ideal weather for parchment, which is not too humid and not too dry. I have lived in humid climates, like here is quite humid in the summer, and so I have to have air conditioning on, or which also functions as dehumidification. And then I've also lived in very dry places. I lived in the desert in Israel, in the Negev desert, and it was like 5 to 10% humidity, so I had to run a humidifier for the parchment. So this is Meir. Meir, as you can see, he's Orthodox. He's actually ultra Orthodox. This is family-run business, and not all of the stores will sell to us. But the women that are my colleagues have a great relationship with this particular family and this particular store. For a while, we weren't sure if they knew that it was us that was doing the writing, because we could have been buying the supplies for our husbands or our brothers or our fathers or our sons. And then one time, this is quite some time ago, over a decade ago, when a group of women were together commissioned to write a scroll. So each of us was writing one of the books of the Torah scroll. And we spent the day, and three of us were living in Israel at the time. So we all spent the day choosing the parchment, selecting all the pieces. And at the end of the day, he turns to us and said, so who's writing? And we were like, kind of looked at each other. Before this, it was sort of like a don't ask, don't tell situation. And so one of us said, we are. And without blinking an eye, he just said, oh, for a reform congregation, reformy. And you said Reconstructionist, but yeah, you're getting the idea. So it's a very interesting relationship. They would not consider the scrolls kosher. I don't know for sure about a Megillah, but yeah, I'm not sure. Certainly not a Torah scroll. And I put this picture here. This is me repairing a scroll. You can see I'm doing this famous line, this famous verse, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, you will pursue. And I just liked it because I happened to be wearing sparkly purple nail polish on that day. So, which is just an image that you don't often see. I write with a turkey feather. You don't have to write with a turkey feather. You don't have to write with any feather. In fact, the oldest and most traditional instrument is the reed. The reed was chosen, actually, it says in the Talmud that the characteristics of the reed being both strong and flexible, merited the reed to be chosen as the instrument for sacred writing. But you don't even have to write with a reed. You can really technically write with anything. It's just that these are most traditional, either a reed or a feather, and they just happen to be very good pens. If anyone has done calligraphy, or if you used a quill when you were in school, you know that they don't come cut as pens. They come as, they were somebody's wing feather, and they were, or there was a plant, but they're both hollow. Feathers and reeds are hollow, and you carve them. You carve the sides kind of in a scoopy form, and then you cut a slit down the center, and that's the ink channel, and you dip it in the ink, and it holds enough to write, 2-3 words, and then you dip again. Now the ink has a few main rules. It doesn't have to, there aren't particular ingredients that it has to have, but it can't have ink from a non-kosher species, so it can't have squid ink or octopus ink, and also it has to be black, so no purple Torahs anytime soon. And then of course it has to last. It's permanent ink. It's not it's not like you're gonna just erase it with an eraser or something. The most common ink that's used is a gall ink, and the way that gall ink is made is these are gall nuts. They grow on certain trees, like an oak gall. They form when wasps lay their eggs on the tree, and the tree has a kind of reaction, almost like an allergic reaction, and forms these balls, and those are called gall nuts. And on the right hand side you see the picture of the inside of the gall nut, and this is the larva. At some point the larva grows up into an adult wasp and pokes a hole and flies away. And if you crush up that gall nut, it's one of the ingredients. It combines with iron oxide or iron sulfate. I can never remember the technical chemistry, but there's a chemical reaction, and it turns black, like permanent black. And that's what the ink is made of. Also, it can have pomegranate juice, wine, vinegar. It often has. I can smell the vinegar. It has, something to make it viscous, like something to thicken it up, like gum arabic, and then it has probably just water, like some kind of liquid. So that is the ink. And there's one more material that I'll discuss, and that is geed, or geeding, plural. So geed is the string that's used to sew the pages together. Unless you're writing a Megillah on a giraffe neck, you need to write it in separate pages and sew it together. It's a very simple stitch, and it doesn't have, there are different traditions for how to do the stitching. It's not like the stitching has to be in a certain way, or it has to have a certain number of holes, but I just do, a running stitch and tie it off, and it's very simple. It's done at the fold, in the inside of the fold. So you can see the stitching on a Megillah or on a Torah scroll. You can see it on the back, but most of it, the knots and stuff, are on the inside of the fold, so you can't really see it. And you see the texts upside down. We don't usually place sacred text face down. We're not supposed to do that because it's not respectful. But when you're sewing, you have to kind of like, I'm touching the objects because I have to touch them in order to write them. So yes. Okay, so before I move on to kind of how letters are formed and different things about the letters, are there any questions?
I have one.
Great.
I thought I remembered that geed had to be made from gut. Or can you use a synthetic thread for this?
No, it has the geed. Yes, that's right. The geed is it's like animal ligament. It has to be made from an animal. That's right. I forgot to say that. Also kosher animal. And it's made, they're like very, very thin, tiny threads. And I saw a video once, it's kind of top secret how it's made, and very few people make it. And they were banging the threads, the small threads together with a Coke can. And they're not, that's the only way that they're held together, is just all the tiny strings just banged together in a spool. And I'll show you, I have this is what it looks like. And this is not a full spool, so you get a little more, but it costs $100 for this because, it's it's from an animal and it's very difficult to make, and etc. So yeah, you can sew it with regular string for 30 days as a temporary hold, but then it needs to be, you know, actually sewn. Other questions?
Nan has a question in the chat. What kind of tree has the gallnuts? Is there anything local to us?
I seem to, yeah, I think oak. I think the oaks around here do. I'm not positive. I know California does. And there's one other common one, but I just remember the oak being the main one. And
Also, Howard has a question. Do you prepare your hands to limit transfer of natural oils onto the scroll?
No, so I don't. Interestingly enough, so I know we talk about, you know, oils not being good, like our natural skin oil not being good for the scroll, but that's a little bit of a myth, because it's kind of like skin to skin. So it's more the dirt that we might have. So I just, you know, I of course wash my hands, and more importantly, dry my hands before, you know, touching the scroll. It's really the water liquid that would do the most damage. But yeah, we're more concerned about dirt than like natural residue, natural oils. Yeah, you've seen tape or glue holding pages together. No, not kosher. Yeah, if you've seen it on your scrolls, I'd be happy to fix that. But yeah, I've also seen all kinds of situation. You'll see I've seen tape when it's not actually holding. So sometimes on the Atzei Chaim of the Torah scroll, it's, you know, it's sewn through, it's looped through. The etz, there's a hole, it's like a dowel with holes in it, and the bead is looped through. And sometimes the holes are covered with masking tape, so it kind of protects from the knot hitting Bereshit, the knot of the bead. So it kind of protects it, but it's not actually doing the holding. But yeah, gluing them together is not, or taping them together is not kosher. The best way to keep ink from dripping in the quill before you place the quill tip to write a letter. So, so if I think I have too much ink, I can just, you know, on the side of the inkwell, just kind of, you know, like, what do you call it? There's probably a word for this, but just kind of run it along the edge and let the extra ink fall back into the inkwell. And you're supposed to test your quill before you use it. So, you know, test to make sure. You don't test it every time you dip it back in, but you test it when you make a new quill before you start writing with it. What kind of needles? Tapestry needles, because they have a large enough head for the bead, which is fairly thick to fit through. Any other questions before I move on to the letters?
Marion asks, what kind of needles do you use?
Yeah, I saw that, tapestry needles, so that the head is big enough for the bead to thread through it. Anything else? All right, here we go. Letters. Okay, so there are 22 letters, or 27 letter forms if we include the final forms of all the letters. And even though there's many styles of script, it's actually one script or one kind of, you know, umbrella script that has many different styles to it. It's called Ashurit. And it's actually technically not a Hebrew. It wasn't first a Hebrew script. It was Assyrian, as you can hear in the name, Ashurit, from Ashur. Syrian. What's it called? Maybe it is Assyrian. Anyway, I'll get back to that. Not Hebrew. So one of the main rules, though, is that a letter cannot look too much like another letter. Aramaic. That's what I was looking for. Aramaic script. And letters looking too much like other letters, the most obvious example is the resh potentially looking too much like the dalet, right? The dalet is cornered, the resh is rounded. And this is an interesting halacha, an interesting law. If one cannot tell whether a letter has correct proportions, let's say you're reading in a scroll. Now, this is not true for Megillah. If you're reading the Megillah and you think you see a mistake, you just keep reading. Half the thing can have mistakes and it's still okay to read from it. Very different rules than from a Torah scroll. Now, I don't know how one can even technically read a Megillah that has half of it full of mistakes, but anyway, so if you don't know, if you're like, this might look too much like a resh, it looks kind of rounded, it's supposed to be a dalet, and it's borderline, and it's a gray area. Who do you ask? You ask a child. I love to teach this to kids because I ask them, who do you think you ask? And they say, ask the rabbi, ask the scribe, ask the cantor, ask the expert. I say, no, we ask you. So for example, here we have a yud, and here we have a vav. Now, if we have something kind of in the middle here, what is this letter? And we're not sure if it's maybe too long for a yud, if it's supposed to be a yud, say, we call a child up. And whatever the child says that the letter is, that is what we go with. They determine the status of the letter. And on the bottom right here, I just thought this is so funny. One of my teachers, Izzy Pludwinski, who is an Israeli, originally Canadian, I believe, calligrapher, Hebrew calligrapher. He talks about proper letter forms, and he brings this example. This is the Egged bus company logo. And it's supposed to be an aleph because Egged is spelled aleph gimel dalet. And he complains like this X is not an aleph. This does not follow the rules for aleph, right? Aleph, it can't just be an X. The lines hit the diagonal in different places. That's a basic rule of an aleph. So I just thought that was funny. You know, Egged is under no obligation to have a proper aleph. Okay, there are also crowns, which you have likely seen. This is on a Megillah, this is on Sefer Torah, this is on Mezuzah, all of the sacred writings. And there are 7 letters that get 3 crowns. The 7 letters are at the top here in this kind of like mnemonic. Shatnez Gatz. Shatnez is the name for the blending of linen and wool, and then Gatz are that's just the remaining 2 letters that didn't fit into the word that we know. And whenever they appear, whether in their regular form or their final form, they get the 3 crowns. And in terms of personal flourishes, I see Eric is asking, it's funny that you asked that now, because I have here's one of the minimal ways that a scribe can like have their own style. I mean, we all have our own handwriting, so in that sense, it always is our own unique flair or style. We can't really help it. But here are examples of different tagine. These are kind of the short, squatty. These are kind of the more flowery, and these are the wispy. People will joke that it reflects your body type. So mine are sort of like the shorter ones. Here's a word from the Megillah, Shashgaz. This is one of the names of the eunuchs and of Achashverosh and of his entourage. And each of these letters has the crowns, which is unusual for this length of a word. So I brought that. What do the crowns mean? Why are they there? Well, there's not really one answer, but this story, I'm just going to read this story from the Talmud. It's actually a very famous story, mostly known for its ending, because we see the punishment of Rabbi Akiva. Punishment for being a grand scholar. So this kind of like disconnect between what happens to him, that he's murdered by the Romans, versus like how amazing of a scholar he was. So here's the text. Rabbi Yehuda says that Rav says, when Moshe ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be the Holy One, sitting and typing crowns on the letters of the Torah. So, right, so this is in their imagination that like there's actual like a literal copying down of all the Torah that Moshe's up on Mount Sinai and like writing it down. Or so first God's writing it, right? So Moses says before God, Master of the universe, who's preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? So as a scribe, I'm thinking Moshe's like, okay, without these crowns, this would take, I mean, it would take instead of a year and a half to write a Torah scroll, like 10 months, maybe, if you don't do the crowns. He's saying there's people waiting down at the bottom of the mountain and will you hurry things up, please? Do you really need to do those crowns? And God says, I do. There's a man who's destined to be born after several generations, a few more than several, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name. And he is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns mounds upon mounds of halacha. And it's for this sake that the crowns must be added to the letters of the Torah. And the story goes on, and Moses is sent into the future and gets to see the Beit Midrash, the house of study of Rabbi Kiva, and he doesn't understand a word, but he feels better when Rabbi Kiva says, and this halacha comes from the crown on this letter from Moses from Mount Sinai. So I see the crowns as representing revelation over time. And there's like always something new to not only discover, but create. Someone might have a question. So Marvin, do you have a question? You can go ahead and unmute if you have a question. Okay, well, you're invited. That's an invitation for the rest of the session. And in the meantime, I'll answer these other questions that are coming to the chat. Are there crowns marks with only 2 lines or 4 lines? There are, so the Bet of Bereshit, for example, gets 4 crowns, and the Daled of Echad and the Shema, and also in the Torah scroll, gets 4. And a lot of them have 1. So the Daled and the Hey and the Kuf all have 1 tag. And there's not really an explanation that I've heard about why these particular letters were selected for this adornment, but it might just be a technical matter because these are the ones with flat heads, flat short heads. So maybe just whenever there's a flat short head, they get 3 crowns. So. Okay. So one of the main scribal rules is that nothing can be written from memory, at least certainly for Megillah and Torah scroll, and not the different rules for mezuzah, because it's expected that you would for sure know that by heart. But by having this rule, it helps us transmit the textual tradition from generation to generation without relying on our fallible memories. So a scribe's tikkun is the scanned copy of some well-known scribe's work. And what it has the text, of course, but it also has little notations. For example, this first arrow is pointing here. So this kind of line of these letters, that's basically a notation that tells the scribe how wide the line is relative to the average width of a line. So the width is counted in yud widths. So you can see up here, this is actually much smaller on my screen, but I think it says samech bet yudin, like rochav amud samech bet yudin, which means the width of the column is 62 yud widths. And so here it says it's 3 yud widths extra. It's 3 yud widths extra. It's 2 yud widths extra. And then down here it's 12 yud widths fewer than normal. And so that way well, you have to squish or will you have to extend a little? Because you can't have half a word and then a dash and then the rest of the word on the next line. You have to fit the whole word in the line. So that's one notation. And then I'm going to jump down here. This says chet rabati, which means large chet. Remember, I was talking about some of the letters are larger than others, like the tav for vatichtov Esther and Esther wrote, or the bet of Bereshit. So here we have another large letter. It's the chet. And this is just a notation that reminds us, make a large chet. So that's some of the little help that a scribe has when they're copying. Questions about that? Okay, my favorite part, mistakes. We all make them. Mostly they can be fixed. The way they're fixed is, for example, if you write the wrong letter, if you know it right away, you can blot off the ink, and then you come back and you scratch off the dry ink with a razor blade or some kind of surgical blade, and maybe prepare the parchment, a little eraser, possibly a little sandpaper. And but there's some mistakes that can't be fixed. If you make a mistake in the name of God, which again, not a problem in the Megillah, but they may be able to be fixed. It sort of depends what the mistake is. But another example is if you skip a line and you don't realize it, and you keep going, and you get to the bottom and you realize you skipped a line. But there's not really anything you can do, because you can't scratch off the whole column, and yeah, you can't like fit it in. So this is very funny. This is a picture from the St. John's Bible, which was a Christian project to write by hand and illuminate the entire Christian Bible. And they had 10 scribes working on it, and they actually did the illuminations before the writing, which, as a calligrapher, I would have wanted to do the writing first and then the illuminations. It would make me too nervous to do the writing when the pictures were already there, when the art was already there. But so this scribe did exactly that. They accidentally skipped a line. So what they did was, given that all the art was already finished, they added the missing line at the bottom and then drew in a bird. And the bird flies up from the line, and its beak is pointing into the spot where the line's supposed to go. Cannot do this for the sacred writings, but I just thought it was really quite funny. So these days, so how do you know if you even made a mistake? You need someone to check your work. Helena, I'll come back to your question in just a minute. These days, there's also a computer check. So you can take pictures, as I did with the Megillah I wrote this winter, and you send a picture of each column, in this case to my colleague and friend, and she has the program and she runs it through the program, and the program spits out all the mistakes, and then you go back and you fix all the mistakes. This is just the first page, by the way. There were like 4 pages of mistakes, but most of them weren't, apparently touching letters, or check this, maybe these letters are touching. This letter's missing the tagin. That's another common. But some of the common types of errors are, of course, letters touching. Letters cannot be touching. Letters have to be fully surrounded by parchment. Also, if letters have a similar sound, like kaf and kuf, for example, or aleph and ayin, or whole words that sound the same but are spelled different, just even though if you know the meaning is different, like if you're saying the word, because you have to actually say all the words out loud before you write them. So sometimes when you're saying them, and we all, I think, do this in English, right? We're typing an email, we realize we wrote the wrong word, for bear, like we meant to write B-A-R-E, but we wrote B-E-A-R, and that's really common. Malay chaser, this is that certain words, especially biblically, whether they're written with or without a vav making, the O sound. So sometimes they're written with the vav, and sometimes they're written without the vav. So when they're written with, it's called malay, full, and when it's written without the vav, it's called chaser. So sometimes you get that wrong. You have to really pay attention. or just alternate spellings. Like in the Megillah, Achashverosh is spelled 3 different ways throughout. So that's, you have to pay attention. And or words that repeat, like the word Medina, there's one line where that word basically repeats 3 times in a row. And there was also an example I forget where it was, but I noted it in my head, 2 lines that had the same exact words. The first 3 lines were the same exact words in one line after the next. So your eye might go to the bottom line and then like fully skip a line. That would be an issue. But I have to say that the best mistake that I ever made, and not to toot my own horn, but this is probably one of the better mistakes out of ever. Instead of writing, it's underlined here, instead of writing Vayimaleh Haman Chema, I wrote, instead of, and Haman was filled with wrath, I wrote Vayimaleh Haman Chem'ah, and Haman was filled with butter. In modern Hebrew, the words sound very similar, Chema and Chema. So I did exactly that. A word sounded like something, and I wrote it as butter. So I hope you enjoy that as much as I do. Okay, just a couple more things, and then I'll see if there's any questions. So if humans make so many errors, why can't we produce these texts mechanically? Why can't we just use the printed Megillah? Or why can't a robot write the Torah scroll, for that matter? And the answers are there are complicated halachic explanations and reasons, many of which were actually explored a long time ago with the advent of the printing press. And by the way, there were definitely plenty of rabbis who thought that it should be considered kosher, a printed Torah scroll. The main concerns were what constitutes writing as a category. And you remember writing in the Megillah is a big theme. So what is writing and what counts as writing? And also what is needed for the intention, for the kavanah, setting the intention of writing, and that each letter and each word has to have intention, kavanah. But I also think there are emotional reasons that we want to keep writing by hand. Right? Initially, we wrote by hand because that was the way to write. There wasn't really any other option. I mean, there was, carving out, but the main way to do it was by hand. There wasn't a mechanical option. And so these days, it's taken on a whole other layer of meaning, especially with the backdrop of everything being so mechanized. And it allows for each and every scroll, every Megillah, every Torah scroll, everything is completely unique because it's written at a certain time in a certain place by a certain person and will look slightly different than any other. And so that is special, especially in this day and age. And I think it affects our connection to it, and it affects how we treat the objects and their sanctity. I will close with a little intro to the scripts. I was mentioning before, remember I mentioned that all sacred writing is done in Asherit. At the bottom you see Asherit. This is a kind of a standard Ashkenazi writing, and this is not a, what do I have here? Oh, that's not Sephardi. Let's go back to the, I don't know why I have that picture. Let's go back to the Tunisian Megillah. That was Sephardi. Here. This is Sephardi writing. You see the flat shin? The shin is flat on the bottom. That's kind of a classic little thing you can look at and know that the writing is Sephardi versus Ashkenazi. But in any case, these are all Asherit, and they come from Ashur. They came later than early Hebrew. On the left, we see kind of earliest, kind of almost pre-alphabetic or like early alphabetic, when we're in that transition between like hieroglyphics. So there's a word for it where the symbol represents a whole object versus a sound or versus a syllable. But we can still actually hear the original meaning of what the image represented by the name of the letter. So, do you see, there's two examples of each letter, but I'll just circle. Here's the first letter. This is the Aleph. And I don't know if you can tell what it looks like. It looks like an animal, an ox, and Aleph, and that's what it meant. It meant ox. We also see, you see the mem in the center here? What's that look like to you?
Mountains.
It does look like
Kind of.
mountains. It's something else. What else might it look like? It was like wavier.
Right, like water, mayim.
Yeah, like water. Right. And how do you say water in Hebrew? Mayim. And how do you say that letter? Mem. Right? That's not an accident. It's because it was mayim. Mem. Similarly, look at this one. I don't know if you can really see what that is. What's that look like to you? Well, it's meant to look like a head. And how do you say head in Hebrew? Anyone know?
Oh, right.
Rosh. And guess what letter this is?
Okay.
Resh. Okay, you can hear that. And here, our letter no longer looks like this, but this was the ayin, and it looks like an I, and that's still how you say I in Hebrew, ayin. So the name, we hear in the name of the letter, we hear where it came from. And Phoenician is very similar to, almost exactly similar to early Hebrew. It's kind of the transition, from this to this over a bunch of centuries. So the letters change and they become a little more abstract. And this is where we have our Roman alphabet from. Look at the Aleph. The Phoenicians, the Greeks took it from the Phoenicians, and then they wrote it. They were writing instead of right to left, left to right. So I think some of the letters started twisting. Well, look at the Aleph and rotate it by 90 degrees to the right. And what do you see?
An A.
An A, a capital A, exactly. So it's all connected. This is a whole class in and of itself, but I thought we would finish that. And now I'm going to go back to the chat. I remember there was a
Julie, I'm just going to interrupt for a second because we traditionally start our minyan at 8 o'clock.
Mhm.
But if there's anyone on here who requires a minyan and wants to be off soon, or if everyone's in agreement and we can continue for another 10, 15 minutes and then have minyan after, that would be terrific. Does that work with your timing?
Me?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So if there's no objections, I would really love to hear Julie finish her presentation. So speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, good.
Okay,
Let's
great.
continue.
So now I can just answer questions. That was the final slide.
Okay, good.
So I'll go back to Helene's question. The layout of the words varies from Torah to Torah. Are there some rules for this? That's right. The layout does vary. Also varies for Megillah. Oh, I'll show you. I have a Megillah. I have my own. This is my own Megillah that I wrote. This is it's a small one. It's a 11-line Megillah. If you're familiar with the Megillah, you might know that the sons of Haman, those are like very, very large. But the only reason they're large is because there's a rule that they have to be on their own column. But since this is only 11 lines, they have their own column at the same size as all the rest. So they're not enlarged in this one. But there are different what are called tikkuns, like layouts for the Megillah and for scrolls. So you have a 21 liner, a 28 liner, 24 liner, 11 liner, and different scribes through the ages. I could make my own. In fact, I'm working on it to do. There's a popular kind of Megillah where every column, not every column, but many columns start with the word Hamelech, the king. It's a very common layout. So I'm working on a Hamolka, the queen version. So yeah, there are certain rules about the spaces, like open spaces between, certain sections. So those are set, what are called the ptuchot and stumot, the open spaces in the middle of the line or the open spaces at the end of a line. Those are set, but if you work around that, you can do really whatever you want. So similarly, if I'm copying someone else's tikkun and I can't fit the line, they can't fit the last word on that line, I can certainly bring it to the next line and figure that out. So you'll see lots of different layouts. There's also a tradition for Torah scrolls. A very popular layout is the Vav Torah scroll called Vavei Amudim, where every column begins with the letter Vav. Which is, it's kind of a pun. It's because Vav means, going back to the letter thing. So the letter Vav means hook, and it used to mean, like the word Vav means hook, and a Vav used to be a hook, and you can kind of see that it would mean a hook. And that was the name for the hooks for the curtains of the tabernacle, and so that's kind of playing with that. But there aren't steadfast rules, and you'll see different layouts. Do I copy from another Torah or Chumash? Yes. So I copy usually from the handwritten, or always really from a handwritten that a scribe has done, so that I can see what they've done and the notations and everything. Also, for example, this again not true for Megillah, but Torah scrolls, names of God, it can be confusing what's a name of God and what's not a name of God. So you have to be careful, because the same word Elohim can be God, or Elohim could be gods, as in, don't bow down to other gods, Elohim Acherim. So you want to, sanctify the name of God, not sanctify the not name of God. There's also cases where there's not agreement whether it's a name of God or not. So you have to do a statement of intention, like on condition, like al t'nai. You say, if it's a name of God, I'm sanctifying it, and if it's not, I'm not, which is kind of a funny loophole. How do I keep the lines so straight? So it's another rule that the parchment has to be scored. So there are lines in the parchment, and if you look closely at any scroll, a Megillah or a Torah scroll, you'll see that it has lines etched in. They're harder to see once there's writing on it, unless you're looking for them, but you can see them easily in between the columns, like the vertical lines and also the horizontal lines. And what you do is, it's different from in English. If we're writing on lined paper in English, we sit the letter on the line, but here we hang the Hebrew letter from the top. So you hang it down halfway from the line. And then, each line tells you where to, that's how we keep it straight. It's otherwise, yeah, we go slowly. Okay. If you make an irremediable error, does the parchment have to be placed in a geniza? Yes. So either it goes to a geniza or it comes around with me for workshops. And for example, I have a mezuzah that I made a mistake in, and I pass it around and see who can find the mistake. Mezuzah is different because you can't really fix an error unless it's at the tail end, because mezuzah has an extra rule, and so does tefillin, that it has to be written in order. So all the letters in their proper order. So if you were to erase an earlier letter, and then write it anew, you've written that letter after all the letters that follow it. Like if you didn't notice that you made a mistake. So So that one, and then I also have a column of Torah in which I skipped a line. And so I have that one as well that I carry around with me, but otherwise, yeah, it would go to the Geniza. As do all little pieces from scrolls. If I'm repairing a scroll, if I resew a seam, like I did on your Torah scroll, those pieces of gid that, you know, fell out, cut out, those go to the Geniza. So why does Esther have to be written on a scroll? Well, because I think, you know, it has to do with, well, it's halacha, it's like the short version, but it has to do with the fact that that the book is all about writing. And that it says in the book that this was written on on a scroll. So I think the rabbis probably looked to that and then said, this has to be written on a scroll. Any other questions that came up?
So if you make a mistake in one column, are you able to slice with another piece of parchment and sew? Or is there a specific width where you have to keep the parameters?
It depends. There is minimal number of columns that you need to have. So you're not supposed to have fewer, on a Torah scroll, fewer than 3 columns. You can sort of b'diavad, like after the fact, if you needed to, in order to save something from Geniza, have 2 columns per sheet. But if my mistake, let's say, this actually happened to me. Let's say I'm writing a Torah scroll, it has 4 columns in that piece, and I make the mistake in the final column. I can splice out that column and then do the next sheet. I could do, in my case, I ended up doing several of 3-column sheets, but you could do a 5-column sheet and then sew that in. That would be okay. But if you made the mistake, say on the 2nd column, then you got to start over. But you never have to start a whole scroll over.
You'd have to start to where you started the seam.
You would have to start exactly the sheet over. Well, you don't sew, you sew it at the end. You don't write with when it's already sewn. So they're just like sheets, before they're sewn.
Right.
How long does it take me to do a Torah? About 1.5 years. And a Megillah takes about 3 weeks. And 45 minutes to read. It's like writing any other book, right? It's like, oh, I spent 9 years of my life writing this book, and then someone listens to it on audio on a 3-hour drive, and that's how it goes.
All right, I don't want to hold up Minyan too much longer. Julie, thank you so much. This was incredible. Again, we are sorry that we were not able to be together in person, but we completely understand. And this was a fantastic, wonderfully educational presentation.
I'm so
we
glad.
appreciate it.
Thank you all for coming. This was really fun. I'm glad you all came. I really appreciate it. I'm amazed. Yeah. So have a good rest of your evening.